doesn't stop, why should we? WION brings you 90 hours of marathon coverage, all the speeches, all the meetings, and the best analysis. President of the United States of America, this democracy
forward, looking at
the road to inclusivity, the road to reform that President Joe Biden and several presidents before him have promised.
celebration of India-US relationship.
A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. How are we going to
From vaccines to climate change, when the world was in distress, India stepped up. The days of observing from the sidelines are over. India is bidding for global leadership to take its rightful seat in the new world order. What does India's path to the top look like? What are the challenges to India's rise? Watch Gravitas US Edition with me, Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay, only on WION. World is One.
Gravitas, live and direct from WION Studios in New York.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas. We are coming to you live from New York City. Look at the magnificent skyline in the background. It's 9 p.m. IST, 11:30 a.m. here in New York. It's a bright sunny morning. All the action has shifted here, and so has our team from Washington DC. The day started pretty early for us. Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the United Nations General Assembly today just a couple of hours ago. He was the first speaker of the day, and he spoke on a wide range of issues. Let me quickly give you 6 key takeaways, though he did speak on a lot of other things. Number one is the Wuhan virus origins. The Prime Minister did not mention China, but his message was pretty clear. He said United Nations agencies have damaged their credibility by making compromises that favored China. Very strong statement. Number two, on Afghanistan, the Prime Minister said that countries should not be allowed to use Afghanistan for their own selfish reasons. The delicate situation in Afghanistan, a clear reference to Pakistan and China again. Number three, a more pointed reference to Pakistan without naming it. The Prime Minister called it out for using terrorism as a political tool. Then number four, he spoke about global economy, and this again, you could say, is about China. The Indian Prime Minister called for the diversification of the global economy, the supply chains. Number five, he spoke about United Nations reforms, very much on expected lines. He said that the global body, the UN, must reform before it is too late. And number six, he spoke about vaccine diplomacy. The Prime Minister called on vaccine makers to make in India. So those were the highlights. This is what the Indian Prime Minister said in his UNGA address.
कोविड के ओरिजिन के संदर्भ में और ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस रैंकिंग को लेकर वैश्विक गवर्नेंस से जुड़ी संस्थाओं ने दशकों के परिश्रम से बनी अपनी विश्वसनीयता को नुकसान पहुंचाया है। ये आवश्यक है कि हम यूएन को ग्लोबल ऑर्डर, ग्लोबल लॉज और ग्लोबल वैल्यूज के संरक्षण के लिए निरंतर सुदृढ़ करें। ये सुनिश्चित किया जाना बहुत जरूरी है कि अफगानिस्तान की धरती का इस्तेमाल आतंकवाद फैलाने और आतंकी हमलों के लिए न हो। हमें इस बात के लिए भी हमें इस बात के लिए भी सतर्क रहना होगा कि वहां की नाजुक स्थितियों का कोई देश अपने स्वार्थ के लिए एक टूल की तरह इस्तेमाल करने की कोशिश न करें। इस समय अफगानिस्तान की जनता को, वहां की महिलाओं और बच्चों को, वहां की माइनॉरिटीज को मदद की जरूरत है और इसमें हमें अपना दायित्व निभाना ही होगा। दूसरी ओर रिग्रेसिव थिंकिंग के साथ जो देश आतंकवाद का पॉलिटिकल टूल के रूप में इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, उन्हें ये समझना होगा कि आतंकवाद उनके लिए भी उतना ही बड़ा खतरा है। कोरोना महामारी ने विश्व को यह भी सबक दिया है कि वैश्विक अर्थव्यवस्था को अब और अधिक डाइवर्सिफाई किया जाए। इसके लिए ग्लोबल वैल्यू चेन्स का विस्तार आवश्यक है। संयुक्त राष्ट्र को खुद को प्रासंगिक बनाए रखना है तो उसे अपनी इफेक्टिवनेस को सुधारना होगा, रिलायबिलिटी को बढ़ाना होगा। यूएन पर आज कई तरह के सवाल खड़े हो रहे हैं। इन सवाल को हमने क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस में देखा है, कोविड के दौरान देखा है, दुनिया के कई हिस्सों में चल रही प्रॉक्सी वॉर, आतंकवाद और अभी अफगानिस्तान के संकट ने इन सवालों को और गहरा कर दिया है। मानवता के प्रति अपने दायित्व को समझते हुए भारत ने एक बार फिर दुनिया के जरूरतमंदों को वैक्सीन देनी शुरू कर दी है। मैं आज दुनिया भर के वैक्सीन मैन्युफैक्चरर्स को भी आमंत्रित करता हूं, कम मेक वैक्सीन इन इंडिया।
It was a very statesman-like address by Prime Minister Modi. He did not just talk about India's progress, he gave solutions for the entire world. On climate change, on the Wuhan virus pandemic, on Afghanistan, on reforming the United Nations, on global commons. As expected, the Prime Minister also talked about Afghanistan. In particular, he had a clear warning for the likes of Pakistan. Do not take advantage of the crisis in Afghanistan. Do not use Afghan soil to spread terrorism. He also had some useful advice for those countries. Sponsoring terror, he said, was a double-edged sword. If you support and fund terrorists, it will ultimately come back to bite you. Maritime security was another big issue. The Prime Minister said that oceans should not be used for exclusion and expansion. No prizes for guessing what this was about. A not-so-subtle dig at China. He emphasized on a rules-based international order. He said that maritime resources should be used and not abused. The final part of his speech focused on reforming the United Nations. The Prime Minister was quite direct here, whether on Wuhan virus origins or on proxy wars or the ease of doing business reports. Global agencies are slipping, he said, or as the Prime Minister specifically mentioned, that their credibility has been dented. His quote on Chanakya was pretty much spot on, and I'll repeat in case you missed it. Time itself undermines the value of the success of something if that was not done at the right time. Now or never. That's India's message to the global community, to tackle China, to beat climate change, to contain terrorism, to keep our oceans free. The time to act is now, and India is willing to lead the way Will Prime Minister Modi's speech be the catalyst for a new world order? What does India's rise mean for the global community? That's what we'll discuss today. Joining me in our New York studio is Suhag A. Shukla. She is the executive director of and the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She's also served as a member in the faith-based security and communication subcommittee of the Department of Homeland Security here in the US. And Vibhuti Jha, a political analyst and managing director at Global Capital Service Group. He's been instrumental in promoting business ties between India and the US. Suhag and Vibhuti, welcome to WION.
Thank you.
I'll start with you. This is what the Prime Minister said today. Democracy can and has delivered. It's a big statement by the Indian Prime Minister, and there's a general feeling that democracy is too slow, that hybrid communism like the China model worked better, but he's saying that democracy has delivered. Do you think that India's rise can be an advertisement for the effectiveness of democracy?
Absolutely. I think that, India has demonstrated that it's not just on a path to leadership, but is a leader. And that's why India has become such an important partner to the United States. Democracy can be messy, but democracy is the way that you can get buy-in from all the stakeholders in order to kind of move forward in a way that allows individual flourishing. Democracy really is the only model.
Yes, and a lot of subtle statements there. So when he talks about democracy, then there is probably a reference to China. When he talks about terrorism, there's a reference to Pakistan. A big pitch for vaccines also. The Prime Minister has invited the world's big companies, vaccine producers, to make in India. Clearly, India wants to take a lead in fixing the situation post the pandemic. How do you see India's efforts in this direction?
I believe that India is heading in the right direction for the simple reason that the Prime Minister is very determined to allay the fears of democracy doesn't work. And if you look at it seriously, democracy was never designed to be an efficient or effective economic mechanism. It is a political tool of governance in which you have a constant check and balance between the executive, judiciary, and the legislature. No one must begin to have a supremacy in trying to rule. So in the economic affairs, as a banker, I can tell you, we always talk about efficiency of capital, effectiveness in performance, and delivering outcomes. In democracy, this is all a delayed item. Things take time to happen. And as a result of which, Prime Minister's message today, that in the Indian context, democracy has delivered, is a signal to everybody that China model faster in relation to democracy, but democracy remains the best tool in terms of achieving equality and equity that is required in the current world that we are talking about. So I think he proved it. India is leading the whole thing. As a matter of fact, despite US interference in supplying the raw materials, which affected India adversely, today US is asking India to open up and start exporting. So this is the recognition of the fact that things can happen, and they do, provided one is inclined to do that and brings about that commitment. So that's the important part.
You said India is already a leader, and speaking as a leader, the Prime Minister said that the United Nations faces the prospect of irrelevance if it does not reform itself. How far has India been able to underscore this point, that it is time for the UN to reform and to give countries like India a seat at the high table?
Exactly. I mean, that is, in terms of the type of work and model that India is providing in terms of a secular democracy in the region is immeasurable. You have, a country that's surrounded by autocratic, failing states, essentially, where human rights are a great challenge. So India absolutely needs to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. I think there's things that the United States can do as well. As a partner, India remains a non-NATO ally, and Pakistan is a non-NATO ally. And I think that the United States has to this kind of cognitively dissonant relationship with Pakistan because Pakistan is undermining stability in the region. it's undermining American interests in the region. It's undermining Afghan interests in the region, as well as Indian interests, obviously, because that's where India is. So reform is necessary. I think that the countries that are emerging and developing need to have a seat at the table. And the first step will be for India to be made a permanent member.
The conversations over the past 2 or 3 days have all centered around Chinese expansionism, the role of Pakistan and its duplicity, the Afghanistan challenge. I think that's personally, from what I've observed, I believe that that's a problem that the Americans want to not talk about anymore. That's something that they've left behind, but it is very much a concern for India. How tangible would you say has been the takeaway for the Indian contingent when it comes to telling its allies and partners that these are the problems that we need to focus on if we are going to be working together?
Absolutely essential. And the point of the matter is here that this is an annual jamboree that happens in New York. Everybody knows that the heads of state come and make their speeches and go back. What happened? And as a result of which, there is a mistrust of the United Nations. And even the United Nations knows that it's no longer effective. It's just a spokesperson for some problem or the other. Things don't move in the UN. And there are entities like China and Pakistan, which Suhag was talking about, if they take advantage of the rule-based systems. Think about it like this. Pakistan is still demanding evidences against 2611 perpetrators in India. How ridiculous is that? So when these two countries are systematically taking advantage of the rule of law, and this has to be dismantled. And I think from my perspective, everything else said apart, the reform of United Nations, that United Nations to be effective, and Prime Minister used that word, that if you want to be prabhavshali and you want to be effective, you have to show action. How can you allow entities like this, who are hated by the world today? This is, people for politically correct reasons may not say so, but hey, Marco Rubio said it in a Senate hearing that Pakistan is a third-rate country. So for a senator who was a presidential candidate to make that statement is very profound, very strong, because all these intelligence subcommittee, they knew. But one thing which I want to point out here is that the US getting out of Afghanistan has ended two things. One is US reliance on Pakistan for supply, as a supply chain entity for US forces, food and equipment included, and paying the rent for that. That has ended. So in my opinion, politically speaking, US is perhaps for the first time experiencing true freedom. Ab main kuch kar sakta hu. Like I can now no longer rely upon, Pakistan is an ally and all that, which itself is a ridiculous thing to happen. So I think these directional shifts that are happening, China nobody likes because of their killer contracts and the bullying they do around the region. So India is becoming that pivot that for an economic and supply chain reasons, India is the country that will have to be your partner. And US recognizes that. That's why Kamala Harris, also the vice president, did not comment upon the human rights issues. She talked about the Pakistani intransigence. She talked about the COVID success of India. She did not raise any untoward issue in relation to India. So that's an important shift.
If I can just add to that, we do a lot of work on Capitol Hill at the Hindu American Foundation. And, 10 years ago, any conversation that we were having with members of Congress on Pakistan, there was just kind of silent nodding. Now, just in this past few weeks, we had 3 amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act calling on the demotion of Pakistan as a non-NATO ally, cutting off of funding, and also asking the State Department to designate it as a state sponsor of terrorism. I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago. So I would agree with you that this exit from Afghanistan has really, I think, opened things up where people on the Hill at least can be more honest.
And we were also making a comparison, although there is no comparison, because the Pakistani leader spoke and he mentioned Kashmir, 15 times. He mentioned India 17 times or something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. He mentioned Islamophobia. He mentioned Taliban. He mentioned terrorists. He keeps saying that give the Taliban a fair chance. Compare that to Prime Minister Modi's speech where he's talking about democracy, he's talking about development, technology, climate change, green hydrogen. Do you see the gap? There is one leader who's constantly complaining and another who's saying that when we, as you said, when we reform, the world transforms, and that is what we're working towards.
Exactly. I mean, it's just, the Prime Minister spoke as a member of the World Alliance. Pakistan is kind of just stuck in the neighborhood. And so I think that begs the question as to why Pakistan enjoys the type of access to the UN, the types of access to the US government. And I think that what was also really telling was the way in which Prime Minister Modi even started his speech, talking about kind of this Indian ethos of integral humanism, which to me is another way of just describing dharma, a way of being selfless, that, you know, the world is interconnected. This pandemic showed this to us in very real ways. And so that means that our well-being is interdependent. And that is the type of message that he conveyed. And I think that his policies are showing largely.
And gave his own example very interestingly as what democracy can deliver.
Exactly.
He said that I was a tea seller, now I've gone on to become the Prime Minister of the world's biggest democracy. I'm out of time, but Suhag and Vibhuti, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It was a very powerful speech at the United Nations General Assembly with the Indian Prime Minister speaking like a world leader. Every state visit has two parts, optics and deliverables. The optics of this trip were excellent. Prime Minister Modi and President Biden were at ease with each other. They joked, they had a semi-hug, and they talked business. But what about the deliverables? What has India secured in this high-stakes visit? Well, I can think of 5 things, 5 key takeaways. Number 1 is a consensus on Afghanistan. India's allies are on the same page. They want the same things in Afghanistan. We saw that during the Modi-Biden bilateral. The Quad summit later on also reflected this. So what is the consensus here? Afghan soil must not be used for terrorism. That's number 1. Afghanistan should not be used to threaten or attack any other country, nor should it be used to train terrorists. The hindrance to this commitment is Pakistan. Prime Minister Modi raised this issue with Joe Biden and the US President agreed. There is a clear sense that Pakistan's role in Afghanistan must be closely examined and monitored. And that's a win for India. There is also agreement on what the Taliban must do. Allow freedom of movement, protect the rights of minorities and women. Basically, it's a speed bump on the entire recognition debate. India has major concerns about the Taliban, and now the world shares them. Takeaway number 2, a roadmap for the Quad. They still have not named China, but Friday's summit did offer some clarity on their mission. The Quad wants to be an alternative to China, to contain China's expansionism, whether on vaccines, development projects, or supply chains. They have announced a new Quad infrastructure partnership. It's a response to China's Belt and Road. The joint statement makes that clear. Here's what it says, and I'm quoting, "We emphasize the importance of supporting open, fair, and transparent lending practices in line with international rules and standards." In other words, no debt traps. That's what the Quad is saying. They also agreed to advance a new 5G initiative and work towards sustainable and resilient supply chains. So China may not have been named, but it was clearly the target. Let me go back to the joint statement. And this is what it says. Together, we recommit to promoting the free, open, rules-based order rooted in international law and undaunted by coercion. That last line is important. Undaunted by coercion, clearly a reference to China again. This clarity on the Quad's role is what India wanted. Now, India can chart a robust Indo-Pacific policy, possibly forge new partnerships. Takeaway number 3, a big vaccine deal. The Quad is set to produce 1 billion doses in India. This will expand India's capacity. It's also a redemption of sorts. India, remember, was called the pharmacy of the world, the vaccine production hub. But that image took a hit during the second wave of infections in India. India had to halt exports, look after its own domestic needs first. The Quad Vaccine Initiative is a shot at redemption. It reaffirms India's position as the vaccine hub. It will also bring its funds and technology. Takeaway number 4, a new era in India-US ties. And I'm not talking about the Modi-Biden bromance or the banter. I'm talking about the substance. First, on terrorism. Here's what the joint statement said. They, Biden and Modi, denounced any use of terrorist proxies and emphasized the importance of denying any logistical, financial, or military support to terrorist groups which could be used to launch or plan terror attacks. Now, India has been saying this for years. Joe Biden has chimed in now. America has promised to expand counter-terrorism operations like intelligence sharing, law enforcement cooperation. Secondly, Biden is backing India's global leadership bid, both for a seat at the United Nations Security Council and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Standard US policy. Biden is extending it. Third, a commitment on trade. Nobody was expecting a miracle trade deal during this trip, but we were hoping for minor breakthroughs. The India-US Trade Policy Forum will be reconvened this year, and the US-India CEO Forum will meet in early 2022. Baby steps, yes, but important nonetheless, after the impasse during the Trump presidency. The Prime Minister also raised the issue of H-1B visas. It found a mention in the joint statement. Quoting again, the leaders noted that the movement of highly skilled professionals, students, investors, and business travelers between their countries enhances their economic and technological partnership. There is agreement in spirit. The trick is to push on. Takeaway number 5, India's arrival as a global leader. This is not about a bloated GDP or a big checkbook. This is about priorities. It's about ambitions. Every world leader talked about beating the pandemic. They talked about sharing vaccines. But what about the next step beyond the talking? What about travel and vaccine certificates? Well, they were silent on this. India was not. Throughout the trip, Prime Minister Modi talked about easing travel curbs. He urged mutual recognition of vaccine certificates, concrete ideas, not rhetoric. Same with climate change. The Prime Minister urged Western countries to do more, to invest in climate action. And just a reminder, India is the only G20 nation that has fulfilled its Paris Accord goals. On Thursday, we told you what India was expecting from the visit, some clarity on Joe Biden's commitments perhaps, on the Quad's future, and on India's role in the New World Order. No foreign visit is perfect, but this one did answer some of India's big concerns. That's optics and deliverables. Check. I've said this in the past, facts have never bothered Imran Khan. He bends them the way he wants, diverts them in the direction he likes, and quite often mixes them with fiction. His latest speech at the United Nations General Assembly succeeded on all 3 counts. It challenged the very limits of reason. This was Imran Khan's 3rd speech at the UNGA, and evidently it was 3 times more disgraceful. He tried to paint Pakistan as victim of terrorism. He promoted the Taliban as a force for good, but he reserved his biggest lies for India. We'll begin with his lies about his own country. Speaking about Pakistan's role in the war on terror, Imran Khan said that Pakistan is wrongly being blamed for the turn of events in Afghanistan, when in fact it has only suffered by becoming an ally of the United States. Those are his words. You must watch this meltdown.
The current situation in Afghanistan, for some reason, Pakistan has been blamed for the turn of events by politicians in the United States and some politicians in Europe. From this platform, I want them all to know the country that suffered the most, apart from Afghanistan, was Pakistan when we joined the US war on terror after 9/11. The only reason we suffered so much was because we became an ally of the US, of the coalition in the war against Afghanistan, where there were attacks being conducted from Afghan soil into Pakistan. At least there should have been a word of appreciation. But rather than appreciation, imagine how we feel when we are blamed for the turn of events in Afghanistan.
Appreciate us, he says. What for? For training terrorists at Pakistani seminaries, for teaching them about jihad, or perhaps for helping them suppress women. Also, Imran Khan speaks as if Pakistan was forced to join this war on terror. It did so voluntarily to suppress Pashtun nationalism. It's something that we have reported on in detail. Islamabad feared the creation of a Pashtun state, so it promoted Islamic nationalism instead. It turned Afghanistan into a mess, which brings us to the Taliban. Imran Khan played their emissary once again. He asked world leaders to strengthen, stabilize, and incentivize the Taliban. It almost felt like the Taliban had sent Imran Khan as their special envoy to the UN. Take a look at what he said.
We must strengthen this current government, stabilize it, for the sake of the people of Afghanistan. What have the Taliban promised? They will respect human rights. They will have an inclusive government. They will not allow this soil to be used by terrorists. And they have given amnesty. Now, if the world community incentivizes them, encourages them to walk this talk, it will be a win-win situation for everyone. Because these are the four things that in Doha, when the US was talking to the Taliban, these were the conditions the dialogue was all about. So if the world can incentivize them to go this direction, then after all, this 20-year of presence, of coalition presence in Afghanistan would not be wasted, because Afghan soil would not be used for international terrorism.
Afghanistan would not be used for international terrorism. What's not to believe in this? Every word we say. Afghanistan has already become the new headquarters of jihad, from Al-Qaeda to the Lashkar-e-Toiba to the Lashkar-e-Jangvi, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Haqqani network, the Tehreek-e-Taliban, the Islamic State. All of these terror groups and many more have relocated to Afghanistan. They're active again. They're regrouping, expanding, issuing statements on defeating enemies of Islam. We are witnessing a renaissance in global jihad. It's happening right under the Taliban's nose, and Imran Khan wants the world to incentivize them. And then he spoke about India. How could he not? I mean, for the last 74 years of its UNGA membership, Pakistan's sole aim has been to seek parity with India on Kashmir. And this time was no different. Imran Khan rattled off a list of concoctions. He called India fascist, a country that is under the reign of fear, a country where Muslims are being persecuted, and Kashmiris being denied their rights. He even accused the West of being biased towards India. Now, we are not going to give him a platform by airing those remarks, because it has become an annual affair for Pakistan to use a global platform to make very personal attacks. This speech is an insult to the United Nations. How did India respond to Imran Khan? With facts. Using the right to reply, India's first secretary at the UNGA, Sneha Dubey, put some facts on the table. She spoke at length about how the entire world has suffered because of Pakistan's policy, and how to this day terrorists continue to enjoy a free pass in the country.
Regrettably, this is not the first time the leader of Pakistan has misused platforms provided by the UN to propagate false and malicious propaganda against my country, and seeking in vain to divert the world's attention from the sad state of his country, where terrorists enjoy free pass while the lives of ordinary people, especially those belonging to the minority communities, are turned upside down. Mr. President, member states are aware that Pakistan has an established history and policy of harboring, aiding, and actively supporting terrorists. This is a country which has been globally recognized as one openly supporting, training, financing, and arming terrorists as a matter of state policy. It holds the ignoble record of hosting the largest number of terrorists proscribed by the UN Security Council.
Inam Gambhir, Vidisha Moitra, and now Sneha Dubey, India's brilliant women diplomats, have been giving strong rebuttals to Pakistan's lies. More power to them. As for Imran Khan, his speech at the UNGA was mostly a rant. Perhaps he feels jilted for still not getting that phone call from Joe Biden. Perhaps he feels left out because the Indian leadership got a red carpet reception here. Whatever his issues, his desperation was embarrassing to watch. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom continues to reel under the impact of Brexit. First, there was a food crunch, then a shortage of daily products. Now the UK is struggling with a driver's drought. Supply chains of fuel have been hit. There aren't enough drivers to transport the fuel. The result is this: unprecedented rationing at filling stations. Some of them have even shut down. The government is advising against panic buying, but long queues have begun to form nonetheless. Many motorists are returning with empty tanks. How serious is this crisis in the UK? Which cities have been impacted the most? Why is the UK facing such a shortage of drivers? And how does it plan to solve it? Here's a report.
These images are from London. Long queues like these are now a common sight in the city. They began to form early morning, persist through the day, and continue all the way to night. Yet there are many motorists with their tanks still empty.
Look at my tank. I don't fill up usually, I leave it, but look at that, it's empty. How am I going to get to work on Monday? You with me? I'm done. I've been to 3 stations.
What is the reason for their misfortune? Brexit and the pandemic. Ever since Britain left the European Union and the Wuhan virus began to spread in the country, the supply chains have been upended. There aren't enough lorry drivers to transport the fuel. Why is that? Because most of them have left.
There is no shortage of petrol. There's lots in the refineries. This is, as has been described many times, about a shortage of drivers, which is a global problem after COVID-19, which has led to too few drivers on the road.
An estimated 70,000 drivers left the UK in 2020 alone. Out of this, at least 12,500 were European nationals. They had begun leaving during the Brexit process. The pandemic catalyzed their exodus. There is an acute shortage of drivers to transport the fuel from distribution terminals to fueling stations. Well, what about domestic drivers? They too have left the industry. An estimated 55,000 quit in the last 18 months alone. Retirement and tax changes being the main reasons. The result is this. Today, UK faces a logistical nightmare. Fuel prices have soared to their highest since 2013. Some petrol pumps are indulging in rationing, while others have been forced to shut down. This includes pumps owned by BP and Esso, the biggest petrol station operators in the UK.
There has been, as you've shown, pictures of queues right around the corner. There has been a steady number of drivers here at this point. The way they plan to tackle it is to try and get those tests up. And if they need to, they're going to bring in the army. But there is a bigger problem that many of the army drivers don't necessarily have civilian licenses.
The British government is under pressure to act. It has vowed to resolve the crisis by doing whatever it takes. But what exactly does it plan to do? Recruit more drivers from abroad. Reporters say the British Prime Minister has agreed to relax immigration rules in order to allow more foreign drivers into the country. There is a talk of a temporary visa scheme as well. Around 5,000 new visas are expected to be issued in the days ahead. But this isn't going to be a popular idea because it goes against the very purpose of Brexit, which was aimed at creating more jobs for Brits and ending reliance on cheap foreign labour. Relaxing immigration rules undermines this message. An uproar is expected. The Brexiteers are bracing for some tough questions. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
It's the end of an era in Europe. After 16 years as Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel is stepping down. Her successor will be elected on Sunday. Merkel represented a rare breed of leaders. She did not give fiery speeches. She did not hold concert-like rallies. She did not have to, because her popularity came from her work. Angela Merkel guided Europe through some turbulent times: the financial crisis of 2008, the migrant crisis of 2015, the Wuhan virus pandemic of 2020. And she did it in her own style, through hectic diplomacy and meticulous management. Her exit leaves a huge void in European leadership, and Germans are confronted with a new question for the first time this century. After Merkel, who?
of the retirement glow? Well, look no further than Angela Merkel. She's got birds on her arms and a wide smile on her face. Very different from the Merkel we are used to. But then again, she isn't carrying the weight of Europe anymore. Angela Merkel was a child of the Cold War. She was born in West Germany in 1954. Politics was definitely her calling, but she took the long road getting there. In 1986, Merkel obtained a doctorate in quantum chemistry. She worked as a research scientist until 1989. That year would change her life, much like it did for all Germans. The Berlin Wall came down, and Germany was unified again. Merkel joined the newly formed Democratic Awakening. Next year, in 1990, she was elected to the German parliament. Thus began a political career that would shape Europe for decades to come. Merkel had a powerful godfather in politics. Helmut Kohl, Germany's longest-serving chancellor. He appointed Merkel as the Minister for Women and later the Minister for Environment. But in 1999, mentor and protege split. Helmut Kohl was accused of corruption. Merkel called on her party, the Christian Democratic Union, to make a new start. In 2000, the party appointed her as leader. The chancellery would come 5 years later. Merkel was the first woman, the first East German, and the youngest holder of Germany's top office. Since then, she's seen it all. 4 French presidents, 5 British prime ministers, 8 Italian prime ministers, and 4 US presidents. Yep, 16 years is a long time. Teenagers in Germany have grown up seeing Merkel. They can't imagine anyone else as chancellor.
I can't remember there being anyone else as chancellor, so for me it's just always been Angie. So it will be weird to have to choose someone else.
Merkel wasn't always a big fan of the European Union. But 100 EU summits later, she leaves office as a firm advocate for the Union. A union she has rescued many times. Merkel has been a loyal firefighter for the EU. She saved the Eurozone, weaved through Brexit, and led the way during the 2015 migrant crisis. But then came Donald Trump. Transatlantic ties took a tumble. Europe needed a firm leader, and Angela Merkel stepped up. This picture of her confronting Trump is one for the ages. At big summits and discussions, Merkel was often the lone woman. She represented half the world population in what was always a boys' club. After 16 years, the curtains are drawing on Merkel's chancellery. Her tenure was all about sober politics. Less soundbites, more action. But her retirement is proving quite the opposite. Merkel memes are flooding the internet. Here are some of the best ones. Danke, Merkel. That's the message across Germany. We hope retirement will be kinder to her than politics. Perhaps more visits to the Aviary. And fewer midnight duels on bailing out Europe. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Nearly 3 years ago, the United States began an offensive to stop Huawei. It banned equipment from the company over spying allegations. It also moved to extradite Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, from Canada. But today, America seems to have retreated from that battle too. The US cut a deal with Meng Wanzhou. She's now out of house arrest in Canada and back home in China. What happened to the mission to make China pay? Is President Joe Biden going soft on Huawei now? Here's a report on the high-stakes secret deal that marks America's withdrawal from another war.
One of the world's most famous detainees is finally out. The Canadians let off Meng Wanzhou, the embattled CFO of Huawei, after the Americans dropped their extradition request.
Over the past 3 years, my life has been turned upside down. It was a disruptive time for me as a mother, a wife, and a company executive. But I believe every cloud has a silver lining.
Meng's release ends one of the most high-profile geopolitical feuds in recent times. Meng is the daughter of Huawei's founder Reng Zhengfei. She was detained in 2018 at the Vancouver airport after an extradition request from the US. The charges were serious. The United States claimed Meng committed financial fraud and deceived 4 banks to evade American sanctions against Iran. Now the Americans have decided not to pursue the case. They struck a deal with Meng in exchange for this admission from her. It says Meng lied to financial institutions and Huawei violated US sanctions on Iran. But despite the clear admission of guilt, Meng hasn't been pronounced guilty for her crimes, nor will she be punished. The charges against her have been suspended for 3 years. They will be dropped if Meng isn't caught committing any more crimes. Meng's detention wasn't just about her business dealings. It was a direct attack on Huawei, the Chinese technology giant accused of spying for Beijing. China had responded to the arrest through hostage diplomacy. 2 Canadian citizens were detained in China just 10 days after Meng's detention in 2018. Michael Spavor, a former diplomat, and Michael Coveridge, a businessman. The 2 Michaels were charged with espionage. The charges were dubious. China was using the Canadians as pawns for negotiations. So when Meng Wanzhou was released, the 2 Michaels were also allowed to go back home.
The aircraft carrying Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor left Chinese airspace and they're on their way home. These 2 men have gone through an unbelievably difficult ordeal. For the past 1,000 days, they have shown strength, perseverance, resilience, and grace, and we are all inspired by that.
The detention of Meng Wanzhou was a bold step in the fight against China. Her release now looks like a retreat, one that could set America back in its effort to contain China's growing influence. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
America's problems do not end there. A new and deadly wildfire in Northern California is spreading. It's destroying homes, forcing evacuations and filling up the air with toxic black smoke. Nearly 6,000 acres of land has been charred. Was this a man-made disaster? Local authorities have arrested 1 woman on charges of arson. Here's a report.
Firemen are struggling to protect neighborhoods in Northern California. The winds have pushed the Fawn wildfire into homes. As of Thursday, at least 25 structures were destroyed. Thousands more are at the risk of burning. Already, the fire has consumed nearly 6,000 acres of area. 4,000 residents of the Shasta County have been evacuated. A total of 30,000 people are affected. Locals are not ruling out arson. 1 woman suspect has been arrested, but this is not the only wildfire that California is struggling with. Across California, more than 9,000 firefighters are battling at least 10 large and active wildfires. So far, these fires have destroyed more than 3,200 homes, commercial properties and other structures. Earlier this week, the wildfires entered the Sequoia National Park. the home to some of the world's largest trees. Firefighters managed to contain the blaze, but the mission to save the trees still continues. Some of them have now been wrapped in fireproof foil. What's the reason behind so many wildfires in California? Experts are blaming it on climate change.
Just since 2020, 6 of the 7 largest wildfires have occurred in California history. Just this year, we have experienced another devastating wildfire season. 2.35 million acres have burned so far.
The situation could get worse. The climate crisis, alongside historic drought conditions, are making the wildfires frequent, more destructive, and harder to fight. Bureau Report, WION World is One.